Sean, one of our directors here, received a call from one of our former residents at night, and obviously the former resident who had been in recovery was needing some encouragement. The 12-step programs work if you work them. And he was of the mindset, and this I think ties with what I'm going to say in the homily, he was obviously troubled by the way our world is going. He said, our world is going to pieces. So why should I bother working on the program? Because, we're going down the tubes. So, nothing is going to change, is his point. So I immediately think of the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the distance. My point would be, I hope from my homily this morning you'll see that we can change our world, but we have to have the courage to do it. And I'd like to talk about the second reading, which is Paul's letter to the Corinthians. He has formed this community, and he loves it dearly, but it's in shambles. It is going down the tubes because of the divisions that are going on in Corinth. There are no less than 4 factions. It's not simply red states and blue states, Republicans and Democrats. It's 4 different factions all fighting. And he is deeply troubled. So he's writing this letter in 57 A.D. in order to deal with those divisions. And each of these divisions, each of these factions have their favorites. One of the factions is they like Apollos. He's an eloquent expert on the Hebrew Scriptures, and people are mesmerized by this guy because, God, he can make those Old Testament, those Hebrew Scriptures come alive. Another group, another faction, they like Peter. He's the top dog, and they're loyal to the guy who is the commander-in-chief, so to speak. The poor and those who have been enslaved, well, they like Paul, and they've been with him all the way. And then there's the proud elite. They're better than everybody else because they claim they got an inside track spiritually. So you got these 4 groups, each with their kingpin, so to speak, and their differences are not just good-natured arguments where we get into a circle and we say, well, I think this and you think that. But their words and actions had become nasty and vicious. People were tearing at one another. Paul is writing this to address those divided minds and those hearts that are torn apart. And he needs to address other issues too. There's doctrinal divisions, there's immoral conduct, and there are personality problems. And he presents in today's reading a theology that if we live it out and apply it in our lives, it helps us to tackle those divisions, that misconduct, and those problems. And his solution is to see that each of us is an essential part of the living body of Christ in our world. If people don't see Jesus in our world, it's because you and I aren't doing our part. Christ relies upon our living, breathing, pulsating bodies to be his body in our world. As our body relies on different organs, the church relies on the gifts of the individual members to bring about that living body of Christ. In working out the analogy, Paul is addressing several problems. With all the differences that exist, how can we be one? with all of our differences, how can we be one? How can we find unity in our diversity? In Paul's day, the Greeks had this question, how can there be one in the many? Our problem is achieving unity despite our political, our social, and religious divisions. Some years back when I had hair, didn't need glasses, didn't need hearing aids, and I wasn't referred to as the old one. By the way, Father John was called the young one, and they were pleased that he kept his eyes open during everything. But that physical concern that we have for being one in the many that the Greeks had, we used to, when I was young, we used to refer to ourselves as a country as the great melting pot. We don't do that anymore. We're not the great melting pot anymore. We're more like a stew. We like to keep our many pieces distinctive, and I suppose that ties a little bit more with what Paul's getting at, that you don't have to be all the same. But even in a small parish, Father John is pastor of parishes in Cohost, New York, and during his sabbatical, I'm sure he's thinking about his parishes and the many differences, even though they're smaller parishes than Father Michael's parishes in Albany. Those differences are still very real, regardless of the size of our parishes or our families. Paul teaches that differences can and should work for some kind of harmony. That's true of the organs of a physical body, but Paul is underscoring that's also true of the spiritual nature of our church, of our world. Why? Because the Christian community is truly to be the body of Christ. We form the living body of Christ that continues to touch lives. And if we're not touching lives, it's because we're not doing our job. Each of us plays an important role. Our gifts, our service, our purpose differ, but each of us has a vital role. We're the body of Christ, we're a work of art, we're a mosaic. We're individual pieces that fit together in interlocking roles. Every member of the church is linked to every other member. No single member is insignificant. Each has worth, each has value. The human body's well-being depends on each organ functioning, doing its part. And the welfare of the body of Christ, the church, depends on each of us. Ideally, we fit together and are so unified that if one of us suffers, all of us are suffering. If one of us is honored, as Paul says, all of us rejoice together. Paul's convinced that peace will return to Corinth if they live out this theology. The question is, do you or I go and buy his theology?